2016, the Pierre Choumoff collection got its way to our museum. Pierre Choumoff was born in Grodno in Belarus in 1872 in a family of a court counselor, and in his gymnasium years he was interested in revolutionary ideas and took part in publishing an illegal newspaper. He took part in St. Petersburg Technological. He studied in St. Petersburg Technological Institute, and in the 1890s he was in relations with illegal organizations in Petersburg and Kiev, and several times he was detained, and in 1906 he was detained yet another time. So in 1907 he left Russia for France, and in Paris he met his revolutionary aide Jan Stojetsky, and he worked in French photographer Felix Bonnet photo studio. So Choumoff decided to become his assistant, and he received his artistic education visiting artistic bohemia in Paris meetings. And in 1911 he launched his own photo studio at Montparnasse, and he turned in a popular photographer, portrait photographer, and he met Auguste Rodin and made several photos of the sculptor in the and from 1912 to 1917, Choumoff managed to create photo chronicles of the recent years of Rodin's life and creative life. In December 1915, Choumoff wrote a letter to Rodin expressing his wish to come up with a photographic collection of his work, and this letter is stored in Rodin's museum archives, and this wish came true, and Choumoff was the last photographer of Rodin and the first photographer of Rodin's museum. In 1918, in Basel and Bern, two exhibitions of Rodin's museum were arranged, and Choumoff's photographs were present there. Pierre Choumoff was famous as a glorious portrait artist. In the 1920s, he created a gallery of photo portraits of famous Russian figures of art, and in 1933, Choumoff had to close his photo studio because of economic crisis of 1929, and in 1935 he moved with his family to Poland and worked as a consultant at a chemical factory in Lodzi, and in 1936 he died of a heart attack, and after his death his wife Ekaterina went back to Grodno, Belarus, and took his collections there, and now it is kept in Rodin's Museum in Paris, Roche Viole Agency in Paris, and Russian State Archives of Literature and Art in Moscow. After the death of the photographer, his name was forgotten, and discovery of his creative work took place only in the early 21st century. There were personal displays that took place in Pushkin's museum in St. Petersburg and Rodin's museum in Paris. And the Pushkin Museum of Art Photography got 113 photographs of Pierre Choumoff created in 1912-1918 with famous works of Auguste Rodin, as well as photographs of Rodin's funeral in Meudon in 1917. Sculptures are photographed from different angles and using different technologies, characteristic for the printing of those times. After we received the photographs, we started studying them in detail. The photographs were printed by the author in different regional technologies: salt print, aristotype, color type, pigment print, and silver gelatin print on paper with two-layer, not traditional three-layer structure. Choumoff attached a lot of significance to the technical side of the work and experimented a lot in his photo studio. He was interested in different artistic effects that could be attained by varying the technology of print and developing out time, as well as using additional layers like chrome oil, and sometimes he also used print toning. And for the detail study, we used Graphic Atlas internet source that is devoted to photograph identification. This project is arranged by the Institute of Studying Stability of Images under the Rochester Technological Institute in the US, and we also invited colleagues from the State Historic Museum to assist us in identification of some of the technologies. Here you can see some examples of Pierre Choumoff's collection. There are sculptures of Auguste Rodin, French journalist and historian Gustave Geoffroy, French politician Etienne Clementel, and Miss Mary Hunter, British politician and writer George Wyndham, Eugène Guillaume, one of the best sculptors of France of the 19th century, Mariana Rousseau, wife of Australian Impressionist artist John Peter Russell. The technique of salt print did not exist for a long time, from 1839 to 1855, when it was substituted with other processes, more stable and not prone to fading. On the verge of the 19th and 20th century, there was a short-term interest to salt print techniques, and recently some photographers also have paid attention to salt print. Salt print is a print with visual developing out, and it is based on light sensitivity of silver chloride, and that is manually attached right on the paper support, and under ultraviolet using contact method, positive image is formed on the paper. And Graphic Atlas website shows full characteristics of the technology. Very often the prints have warm shades, and the color varies from light brown to red brown, and the final color of the print depends on the type of paper and time of exposure and quality of washing. And salt print has no binder layer, and that is why the prints almost always have matte surface. The texture of the surface is the same as the paper, and salt prints can be found in different formats. They can be mounted on a support on passepartout and can be found in books and albums. Sometimes they are found freely. As for the damages that are characteristic for salt print, there are foxings, fading, yellowing, and deteriorating detailization on light spots. And salt prints are also prone to silver oxidation, and silver is acidated to colorless ions of silver, and it moves, and sometimes it gets back to the metallic state, and the result of this process is print fading and overall change of hues. Because there is less silver in the highlights, fading is usually noticeable there first. Oxidation is caused by environmental pollutants, contact with poor quality storage materials and poor quality mounting materials, and is accelerated by high heat, humidity, and exposure to light. The sculpture portrait of Jean Daire, Le Bourgeois de Calais, show all characteristic features of salt prints. We can see the yellowing of paper and the change of the tone of the surface, and the print was made in 1916 and 1918, the size 21 by 16, and salt prints show fading, which is more visible or tends to occur from the edges into the center of the prints. The print also displays signs of retouch. Choumoff used retouch, applying to negatives very often to create the image necessary. According to Valentina Glutron's study from Rodin's museum, he used two types of retouch. The first one, most often, was done by the ordinary pencil right on the negative. Without pressing hard, Choumoff attached, using the pencil, very fine strokes to those sections where he wanted to erase certain details from. And as this operation was done right on the negatives, when they were printed, instead of the pencil strokes, they were just lighted sections with seemingly no defects. And the second method was using a special substance that was applied to the negative. Salt prints have one layer structure, and the silver image rests within the fibers of the paper support. As a result, salted paper prints typically have a matte surface sheen, and silver particles rest on the top fibers of the paper support. Here is an example of salt prints with 50 times magnified, and we can see the paper fibers really clearly, and the paper fibers are visible and the image rests within the paper fibers. Another example is Pope Benedict XV, and the print is of light brown color. The surface is matte, and we can see clearly the main signs of salt print: fading of the print and deteriorating details. And on the reverse, we can see the stamp print, Choumoff, photograph 5, Bourg Saint-Jacques, Paris. Choumoff experimented a lot and made several prints from the same negative. For example, Choumoff's images of sculpture portrait of British politician and writer George Wyndham can be given. Two prints have different tones but are made in the same technique of salt print. Paper fibers are clearly visible in both prints, but on the right-hand side print they are less visible, and the image is located in the upper layer of the fibers. Here are three variants of sculpture portrait of Mrs. Mary Hunter. The first two are made in salt print technique, and in the third one the fibers are barely visible, and we can see particles of the pigment, so that is pigment printing on paper with the two-layer structure. Here are two variants of French sculptor Jean Guillaume portrait. All three prints are made in salt print technique on matte paper. Despite the difference in tonal gradation, that is one and the same print technology, salt print technology. And we can assume, as the paper fibers are less visible in the first print, that the prints are toned and have certain surface. Untoned paper are usually of reddish shape, whereas sodium sulfate or gold usage gives purple and brownish tint. Talbot used hypo for fixing, and gold was started to be used with the early 1850s. In Memoirs of Moise Nappelbaum, he mentions that photo paper for day printing, after intensifying with gold, was additionally treated in platinum intensifier, and the surface of a print can sometimes be coated with beeswax, varnishing, albumen, and gelatin. They were used as a way to protect them from atmospheric pollutants, to make them appear glossier, and to prepare prints for hand-applied coloring. Salted papers made with sizing, or those that have been coated with will exhibit a slight sheen on the surface of the print. Sometimes salt prints were covered by albumen, and albumen helps salt print to stop being prone to fading. That's why sometimes we can mix salt print with albumen print, mostly in matte paper. And here we can see where the image is in relation to the paper support. Salt print with additional coverage and albumen print on matte paper are really alike, and it is very hard to differentiate them. A period in identification of photographic technology can be made by X-ray fluorescence analysis that can be used to define the composition of substances in the print. And Getty Research Institute in Los Angeles in 2013 had carried out a research of William Henry Fox Talbot salt prints from Getty's museum collection to define the composition of particles, and X-ray fluorescence analysis showed that Talbot's photograph have concentrations of silver, which is the imaging element of all of the images, traces of calcium and iron from the paper substrate. And many Talbot's prints also showed presence of cobalt and arsenic, and in 1997 cobalt was also detected in salt prints photographs during our investigation of salt prints of David Octavus Hill and Robert Adamson. And both elements are connected with the presence of some particles of smalt that used to be added into paper mass fibers to prevent yellowing of writing paper. And smalt particles were added into paper fibers to increase white property of it. And paper for salt print negatives and positives require a relatively high wet strength to withstand treatment in toning and fixing baths and multiple washings after developing out. This was accomplished by internal sizing of the paper using different organic binders. The photographic literature describes the preference of English paper mills for using gelatin as the internal sizing, and the use of starch-based internal sizing by French and other continental paper mills. Presence of sizing agents in papers like gelatin or starch tend to give them a slightly less matte appearance. They would be more glossy, but would retain all the surface characteristics of paper. Choumoff's photographs from Pushkin's museum collections have been studied only using the visual method with the magnifying glass or microscope, and in the future we are planning to come up with an X-ray fluorescent analysis to define the composition of the photographs and the ratio of silver in certain imprints. And Choumoff's photographs carry not only historical value, but also the artistic value, as they are printed in different original techniques. Thank you very much for your attention.